So welcome to this training where I'm going to talk about the topic mindset and what it's got to do with recovery. So if you're watching live, do say hi. If you're watching replay, just put hashtag replay. So some people say that mindset has got nothing to do with recovery because mecfs is a physical condition. Other people say it's got everything to do with recovery. So who is right? So we'll explore that topic. Now, I have made another video where I talk about mecfs and mindset, so do check that out. It's on my Facebook channel and also on YouTube. And in that video I talk about the difference between fixed and growth mindset. If you're watching, let me know, what do you think? Do you think that mindset has got anything to do with recovery? Pop in the chat, put a Y for yes, I do think it is important for recovery, N for no, DK for don't know, and whatever you answer is completely fine. So I'm going to talk about some of the things that I cover in my building resilience training. One of the first things we do in module 1, which is about getting clarity. Julie says hello Julie, nice to see you. Thanks for letting me know you're there and you can hear me and see me, I presume. But in my building resilience training, in the getting clarity module, the first module, we talk about mindset. The mind affects the body. If you're uncertain about that, then I'd really invite you to, let me just grab the book, read this book called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers, okay, by Robert Sapolsky, Professor of Neurology and Biology at Stanford University. Okay, so he knows what he's talking about. It's quite a technical book, but it talks all about the way that the mind can affect the body. You know, there are various examples of how the mind affects the body. So the placebo effect is one example. You know, the placebo effect is the effect produced by the power of belief. So we've got a couple of yeses. So, you know, I'm not the only one. It's good to know that I'm not the only one who thinks that the mind and mindset is important. Melanie also says Y for yes. And I know actually other people do, because I've worked with many people who recognise that their mind and their mindset is affecting their health and their recovery. So yeah, okay, so quite a few yeses. So thanks for responding. So as I say, placebo is one effect. Exams or driving lessons are examples of the mind affecting the body. How many people, if you learn to drive, needed to go to the loo before your first lesson? I did, okay? If that's you, just put M for me as well. So I know that I'm not the only person who was really nervous about being in control of a ton of steel, okay? We know that persistent stress makes it more likely that we get diseases that make us sick. That's straight out of Robert Sapolsky's book. And we also know that stress can hinder recovery. So stress can be acute physical, can be chronic physical. So acute physical is being exposed to virus. Chronic physical, having an ongoing health condition. And it can also be affected or activated by psychological and social stress. Okay, if you have a health condition that people don't believe, that's a social stress. Okay, so our mindset is driven by our sensations. Our mindset is driven by our emotions. And I talked about that in last week's video where I talked about sensitivity and reactivity. So I won't go into that now, but check out that video. People who have watched it said they found it super helpful in understanding the link between trauma, be it big T trauma or small t trauma, and how it affects our thinking, our beliefs, our feelings and our behaviours. For example, if you're an overachiever, then you keep pushing and crashing, okay? But that overachiever pattern might be a compensatory strategy. Again, I talked about that last week, so watch that video. But our mindset affects our relationship to our emotions. The degree to which we feel comfortable or uncomfortable. So some people have a very particular relationship to comfort zones and safety and certainty. Some people like to stay in their comfort zone. Some people love to stay out of their comfort zone. For example, if experiencing some emotions puts you out of your comfort zone, then you might do everything you can to avoid experiencing those uncomfortable emotions. And so the goal is to build our window of tolerance. All right. So, for example, there was a time when I had mecfs that the idea of doing physical activity or going out for a meal put me in a state of stress because I wasn't sure whether I could handle doing that activity, whether it was going to make me crash or relapse. Now, or have a dip. The problem was I was generating a lot of stress. And had I not been generating the stress, my body could have tolerated that activity, as long as it felt appropriate to do that activity, more than when I was generating loads of stress. Okay, so let's talk about some of the mind shift patterns that I think are useful to make. One of the things I talk about in that first module is the art of learning. So let's talk about the first two letters of that acronym. So the A stands for allowing yourself to be a learner. If we allow ourselves to be a learner, accept that it may take some effort to break patterns, to break out of your atmosphere, then we're more likely to be patient with ourselves when we don't make change as quickly as we like. Consider this rocket, Apollo 11, okay? Any guesses how tall that rocket was? Pop in the chat, meters or feet. Have a wild guess. And it'll let me know that you're still with me and can hear me. How tall do you think Apollo 11 was? Okay, I'll give you a moment to do that. But if you look at this tip of the Apollo 11, okay, which I've circled, that is the capsule that they came home in from the moon. Okay, now consider the size of that capsule compared to the rocket. The rocket was actually 363 feet tall, or if you're metric, it's 111 meters. And the vast majority of that rocket was taken up with fuel. So it actually took a lot of energy, a lot of fuel to get that rocket to break out of the Earth's atmosphere. But once it was out of the atmosphere, then it didn't really actually need that much fuel to get back home. They literally had to set their course, and because there was very low atmosphere and friction, they weren't having to fight against those factors, all right? So they didn't need much fuel. So the point I'm making here is it may take some effort to break out of those limiting patterns, those mindset patterns, being the overachiever, being the helper pleaser, being the perfectionist. All right, might take some effort to break out of those patterns. But once you break out of that atmosphere, that limiting comfort zone, then actually it takes less work because you've broken the pattern. Okay, so the A stands for allow yourself to be a learner. The R stands for repetition. We need to be prepared to do the reps, to use the tools and techniques that are going to help us break those mindset patterns that actually put our body in stress, that actually hinder recovery. Okay, so the second R stands for recall. We need to practice recalling what we're learning, and the T stands for teaching someone else. So that's less relevant to mindset, but useful aspects of the art of learning. All right, so Julie says, I get you. Excellent. So the next mindset shift that we talk about in the training is about going pro. Now, you may already have gone pro, okay? So you could give me a red, orange or green. Red, I really need to work on this. Orange, I'm doing okay, but could do better. Green, I'm completely nailed it. So what do I mean by going pro? Well, when I first had mecfs, I was dabbling with recovery. Okay, so I wasn't really doing everything I could, to a reasonable practical level that could have supported my recovery. One of my coaches talks about going pro, the difference between the amateur who dabbles and the pro who says, I'm really serious about this, and this is going to be my total focus. So consider an athlete who's absolutely committed to getting up, training, showing up, doing the work. And actually, I remember working with a client, and that was her mantra or motto, that she showed up. She showed up to our sessions, and that was really important to her because it was actually she found it really difficult to show up. It kind of really was stepping out of her comfort zone, exposing herself, but she trained herself to get okay with that, to get feedback, and she soon learned that I was on her side, and so she was less anxious about getting feedback. All right, so I really encourage you to think about that concept of going pro. What would you say? You red, orange, green currently, so I'm seeing an orange, a red. Next thing is to become the hero. All right, Joseph Campbell talks about the hero's journey. Okay, we have to decide to be the hero. Think about all the Disney films you've watched, where one of the themes is about having courage to handle your fears, to step outside your comfort zone in a manageable way, to say yes to growth, yes to challenges. So the next thing is to think about the standards you set for yourself. So again, when I first had mecfs, once I got out of the bedbound phase, I was, for quite a period, literally in bed the whole time, not doing anything else other than eating and sleeping because I was so exhausted. But once I got out of that phase, I was able to do a bit more. I still had to rest quite a lot, but over time that shrunk and shrunk and shrunk. I went from resting for 3 hours in the morning, 3 hours in the afternoon, to an hour in the morning, an hour in the afternoon. That went down to half an hour, went down to 20 minutes. I still meditate 20 minutes twice a day because I think it's a useful thing to do. But when I was able to do more, I wasn't really setting high standards for myself. So I wasn't expecting much of myself. So I wasn't very focused. I wasn't creating structure. But over time, I recognized that if I wanted to do everything I could to support recovery, I needed to create some discipline. For instance, not spending too much time doing stuff when I know that didn't help me. So for instance, if I was watching a film or whatever, I had to time limit it. I'd say, actually, I can manage about an hour right now. And challenging though it was to pause the video and say, okay, I'll come back and watch the next part of the film tomorrow, I had to get good at that. At one point, I was really rubbish at it. And there were times I chose, I'm going to watch this whole film and I am going to feel a bit tired, but that's okay. All right. But I had to set some standards for myself of what I expected for myself. Okay. Next thing is, had to really be proactive. So for me, that meant, okay, I'm going to create a movement regime. It might start really small. So at one point I was literally doing a minute of Qigong, 1 minute a day. 1 minute, 3, 4, 5 times a day. Again, I've made a video about movement. I think that was a couple of weeks ago, so check that out. I talk about some strategies for creating a movement regime, even if you're limited. So check that out. And the next mindset pattern I want to talk about is the Viking mindset. Any ideas why I'm talking about Vikings? I've talked about this before. What did Vikings do when they landed on foreign soil? Any guesses? What do you think Vikings did when they landed on foreign soil? And the answer isn't setting up knitting groups, which Alan commented a while back, which made me giggle. What do you think Vikings did when they landed on foreign soil? Put your answer in the chat. I know there's a bit of a time delay between me talking and you hearing me, so I hope someone's typing the answer. But what they did is they burned their boats, okay? So they were essentially saying there's no turning back, okay? Now, sometimes, and this has happened very rarely, but some people, they've started the training, and I remember one person who was experiencing anxiety said, actually, it's too hard. I was training 3 people, and she decided after the first day to quit the training. And she just said, it's too hard. And I kind of get that, because at one point my anxiety was debilitating, okay? But I knew I just had to persevere, and I did massively shift those patterns. I went from being a person who was very anxious a lot of the time to someone who sometimes experiences a bit of anxiety, but it doesn't take over my life in the main, okay? So Julie says fight. They did do that, but what they did is, yeah, they burned their boats. There was no going back, all right? And so I really encourage people, look, if you feel discouraged, that's understandable, but that is a mindset pattern, and you can shift that mindset pattern. There's things that you're doing, saying to yourself, which might be unconscious, that mean you're getting discouraged, all right? And so we need to build that resilient mindset that says, okay, you know, there might be times when I feel like I'm not making the change that I want, but I'm going to keep going. There's a book I've got. I always forget the name of the author. I keep thinking it's this book by Peter Drucker called Managing Yourself, but I think it's another book where this chap who talks about developing mastery, and he says we've got to learn to love the plateau. So there might be times where you're, you know, using tools and techniques to help you break unhelpful patterns, help support your healing, and you might feel, I don't feel like I'm getting anywhere. But you have to keep doing the work, because the change is happening at an unconscious level. And at some point you'll make a breakthrough. I've experienced that personally. I've worked with many people who recognise that pattern, and it applies not only to, you know, brain training tools, but it also applies to other spheres. I remember a friend of mine who's a really good piano player, I think she's grade 8, says, you know, sometimes she's hit a plateau, but she kept working at it and she'd make a breakthrough. Okay, so what I want you to consider is your identity. Okay, are you a quitter? You know, I used to be someone who dabbled and gave up easily and tried something else. And I trained myself to just be more persistent, to stick at something. And I really encourage you, when I train people, I invite them to become a resilience builder. So in the training, we talk about making PACTs. Okay, so what does that stand for? The P stands for patience. So we need to make that shift, mindset shift, from being impatient to patient. We need to make the shift from being resistant to what is to accepting. Because as you may have heard me say before, when we resist what is, we lose, but only 100% of the time, says Byron Katie. We need to make that shift from anxiety and fear to calm, okay? And we need to cultivate trust. We need to make the shift from fear to trust. Many of us have installed unconsciously, unknowingly, fear operating system. And therefore we need to uninstall that operating system and install the trust operating system, okay? And with work, we can learn to integrate the part of us that operates from fear with the part of us that operates from trust. So the part of us that is wise, is calm, is pragmatic, is accepting, compassionate, can take care of that part of us, which I like to think of as our inner child, the wounded part of us. Okay, we have got an inner parent that can take care of that part. And an important part of the work is learning to connect to that part of you that is wise. You know, that part of you has shown up many times in your life. I was talking about this last week. All right, that part of you just responded to a challenging situation in a resourceful way. And how often do you remind yourself that you have that part? How often do you remind yourself of all those times when the awesome you showed up? Okay. And the S stands for strength. So making that shift from self-doubt, lack of courage to strength, okay, and courage. And those letters, the first letter of each of those words spells PACTs, all right? So last thing I'll leave you with, okay, is win or learn. This is the mantra of Ray Dalio, who's one of the most successful investors on the planet. And he talks about training yourself to adopt that growth mindset. I either win or I learn. So we don't focus on failure. We focus on feedback. This is information that I can use. What can I learn from this? Okay. So consider that your psychology affects your physiology. Your psychology affects your biology. Your psychology affects your neurology. Okay. And we can influence the way we look at things, the way we see things. Okay. I've had clients who have made changes quickly. All right. So I've talked about a client called Siren who came in a wheelchair, and on the second day she walked into the clinic. Another client called Benta also came to the training, flew from Norway using a wheelchair, and she stopped using it during the training. Sent me a picture of her climbing mountains. And one of my clients, Chris, journalist, he said to me, he emailed me and he said, I'm coming to one of your talks. Just to warn you, I'm a journalist. I'm going to be asking you lots of difficult questions. And I said, Chris, you are welcome to ask me your questions. I will find that very interesting and stimulating. It was a great talk. About 6 people showed up to the talk. 3 of them signed up for the training. He was one of them. One of his goals was to run a marathon. Within a couple of months, he was training for it. Okay, he wasn't ready to run a marathon, but he was back to running, and he became a big advocate of this training. Because of him, I got to do some training to one of the top 10 law firms on the planet. So, but other clients, it took them longer. I had another client who wanted to run a marathon, and when I first talked to her, she was in tears. She was so desperate for recovery, and her goal was to run a marathon. She got back to training. She was about to do the marathon and had to pull out because she got a knee injury, but a couple of years later, I think, she actually ran a marathon. And another client, Leo, he was in a wheelchair, and it took him a bit longer. He, said it took him about a month before he stopped using his wheelchair. He pushed it down the hill in the garden, and he never used it again. I did mean to get some photos, but I've been really super busy today, didn't get a chance. So consider that, when I train people, we focus first on mindset. And we do more work on how to shift limiting beliefs. We do that straight away, but also focus on that in later modules. All right. A lot of the work I do is about helping people shift their beliefs because they are limiting. They're causing them stress, and that's not helping recovery. So I'm going to pause there. If you've got any questions, get in touch. I am going to be starting a new Building Resilience group program in May. If you'd like to know more, put group in the comments and I'll send you details. But thanks for watching. Keep going. You've got this. Wishing you great health. Bye for now.